Hello, our two main characters haven't seen each other in 20 years, and now they're teaming up to fight together and save the world. Curious about what happened? You're about to discover it. But first, let's go back to the year 1996. We're in a high school locker room. A chubby guy is dancing in the shower while his classmates are giggling and watching him. Meanwhile, in the school's tower hall, the student of the year is being celebrated. Popular student Calvin Joyner, also known as Golden Jet, has been selected for the award. He starts his speech to the audience. However, his speech is disrupted by an unusual event. A large man is shoved out of the shower and into the gym, totally naked. People begin to laugh, but Calvin feels sorry for the poor guy. He offers him his sports jacket and assists him in covering up. Fast forward to the present, Calvin is no longer the person everyone loves. He works in an office, grimly observing his colleagues getting promoted, and tolerates his co-workers' silly jokes. He is married to his high school sweetheart, Maggie. While having dinner with his wife, Calvin mentions he won't attend the reunion that's planned in a few days. Wants to go. Maggie is quite unhappy about it. She has spent a lot of time preparing and has carefully chosen a beautiful dress. Her husband admits to her that he isn't ready to face questions about his career. After all, everyone had anticipated that he would at least secure a governorship position. But instead, he has ended up as just a simple accountant. The next day, in 2001, Calvin is scrolling through his social media feed. Suddenly, Calvin realizes that someone named Bob Stone has sent him a friend request. He has no idea who Bob is, but decides to accept the request anyway. After that, Bob invites Calvin out for a beer. Curious, Calvin asks Bob how they know each other, and then it hits him. Bob is the outsider from high school. Calvin is left speechless. Without hesitation, Calvin agrees to meet up with him. Calvin just can't believe that the tall guy standing in front of him is the same Robbie he used to talk about back in the day. The entire high school burst into laughter. The boys sit down together to enjoy a beer, chat, and have a great time. After some time, Bob heads over to the bar to grab more beer, and meanwhile, the guy on the left attempts to take his seat. Calvin tries to explain politely to the stranger that the seat is already occupied, but his attempt only complicates the situation further. Bob comes back and swiftly resolves the issue. Calvin is stunned by what he just witnessed. Bob invites him for a bike ride, and they go to the high school. As Calvin recalls memories, Bob appears quite sad. He shares with his new friend that he hasn't undressed in front of anyone since that night. Suddenly, they see a display dedicated to the graduates of the 60s and 90s. The box resembles an altar dedicated to Calvin's achievements, filled with trophies, photos, and certificates. Despite this, Calvin isn't pleased with any of it. Feeling frustrated, he heads back home and bids farewell to Bob. Yet, he isn't rushing to part ways with his new friend. In 2001, Bob mentions he's recently encountered issues with his payroll. He suggests that Calvin's professional expertise could be beneficial and invites himself to Calvin's home. They are unable to check the bills because Bob accidentally spills beer on Calvin's laptop. Bob then asks Calvin if he could stay over for the night. Calvin agrees, allowing Bob to spend the night sleeping on the couch. The following morning, Calvin enters the kitchen and hears a knock at the door. At the door is a woman who introduces herself as an agent from the CIA. "You send." Calvin quickly betrays Bob, but the big man has already disappeared. Officer Harris informs Calvin that Bob is wanted for both murder and treason. Calvin realizes things are getting intense and ends his friendship with Bob, yet Bob has listed him as the emergency contact. Officer Harris informs Calvin he'll be used as bait and follows him to the office. At the office, Calvin hears the phone ring. It's Bob, saying he's in trouble and needs to meet urgently on the office stairs. The CIA team quickly heads to the agreed location, but Bob cleverly outsmarts them. Calvin is eager to understand the situation, yet Bob stays silent. He places a gun in his friend's hand and, for reasons unknown, initiates a fire. Calvin then dashes out of the office screaming. A fierce shootout follows and Bob manages to incapacitate nearly all his pursuers. Bob and Calvin almost make their escape, but the CIA team intercepts them at the elevators. Bob engages in polite conversation to buy himself a little more time, and then my moment is coming up in 3, 2. The office descends into complete chaos, and Bob seizes the chance to make his escape. The big guy crashes through the picture window, leaps down with Calvin, and lands right on an inflatable gorilla. Once in the car, Bob finally takes the time to explain to his friend what's happening. He says that a criminal known as Black Badger stole the keys to the American Spy software 3 weeks ago and is planning to steal it. They are currently selling it to the highest bidder at the auction, which is 2001. However, Calvin doesn't even want to listen. He asks Bob to let him go, expressing that he doesn't want to take part because Bob is a criminal. Bob then reveals the truth. Bob and his partner Phil were very close to reaching the thief's hideout, but just as they were about to arrive, Phil got trapped in an elevator with a bomb and unfortunately died. Bob was unable to catch the criminal and ended up being blamed for Phil's death. Calvin feels bad for his friend, but he still asks Bob to let him go back home. However, Bob helps him understand the situation. Officer Harris has already placed Calvin's house under constant surveillance, which means Calvin is involved in the operation whether he wants to be or not. But before they can continue talking, an unexpected visitor interrupts them. As Bob is handling an intruder, Calvin takes the opportunity to steal his bike. He quickly calls his wife, urging her not to return home but instead to meet him at the office of their new marriage counselor. However, on his way there, he is stopped by Officer Harris. She manages to persuade Calvin that Bob is indeed experiencing a mental breakdown and is, in fact, the Black Badger. This revelation leads Calvin to start trusting the officer. He retrieves the tracking device, which he needs to activate when he eventually meets Bob. Calvin is running late for his scheduled marriage counseling session. "Hello, Calvin." "Hey there." "Oh, shh." To avoid putting Maggie at risk, he acts as if he doesn't know Bob. 2001. They engage in association games and role-playing, but Calvin reaches his limit and loses his temper. His wife becomes upset with him and decides to leave. Calvin is on the verge of activating the device, but Bob intervenes and stops him. Bob assures him that he doesn't have any of the codes. To locate her, he requires Calvin's assistance. Oddly, Calvin trusts him and introduces him to a friend who specializes in international dealings. This friend is Trevor, who humiliated Bob in high school 2 decades ago. Trevor provides them with a transaction number and starts off being courteous. He even apologizes for his past actions towards Bob. However, it quickly becomes apparent that this is simply another one of his pranks, and he hasn't changed at all. Calvin is confident that Bob would now teach the old tyrant a lesson, yet Bob appears to be paralyzed and leaves the office quietly. Calvin follows him out and then receives a call from Harris. She insists on knowing his whereabouts and instructs him to keep Bob there until a team can arrive. Outside, Bob tells Calvin that he was the only one who never bullied him. That's exactly why he's the only friend Bob can truly trust. At that very moment, Calvin admits that he has just betrayed Bob to the CIA. Harris begins to interrogate Bob, but he doesn't utter a single word. She then orders them to bring in torture instruments, and meanwhile, Calvin comes up with a plan to distract the guards. So then, Calvin gets the keys and enters the interrogation room. The partners secure Harris to the table and then leave him there as they walk away. Bob inquires whether Calvin still possesses the transaction numbers. It turns out that these numbers are actually the coordinates for the location where the deal is supposed to happen. The friends input the coordinates into a burner phone and discover that the deal is set to occur in Boston. The partners then proceed to look for an airplane at a private airfield. As Calvin manages to distract the local security guard, Bob gets busy preparing the plane for their flight. Eventually, the friends reach their destination. Calvin is anxious because the area where the deal is supposed to happen seems unfamiliar. He spots the entrance to the underground parking garage nearby and becomes certain that the meeting will occur there. Bob commends him for his swift thinking and suggests they should divide their efforts. In the parking lot, Bob notices a group of men together with the customer 2001. At the same time, Calvin spots Harris at the entrance to the parking lot and concludes that she must be the Black Badger. He attempts to call Bob, but Bob doesn't pick up the phone. Calvin quickly rushes to the parking lot to alert his friend, but after shooting his partner, Bob takes a USB drive out of his pocket. All of a sudden, Phil emerges from behind a pillar. The man, who was thought to be dead, reveals that he is actually the Black Badger and possesses the codes. The customer starts getting impatient and demands the return of the 2 USB sticks. The former partners toss the drives onto the ground, and at that very moment, a CIA team storms into the parking lot. A fierce battle breaks out. Calvin, who has already managed to recover, quickly picks up the sticks from the ground and makes a run for it. The customer in a car nearly catches up with him, but Bob manages to save his friend just in time. Calvin escapes to the nearby bridge. He is not alone for long, though. Soon, Bob is on his left side and Phil is on his right. Each of them pleads with Calvin to trust him. Bob and Phil begin shooting at one another. Phil loses his gun, and Calvin picks it up. Whether due to distrust or bitterness, Calvin decides to shoot Bob. Phil asks Calvin to hand over the codes. Then Calvin attempts to shoot him as well, but the gun has no bullets. Eventually, the truth is revealed. Phil explains that Bob could never have been the Black Badger because he was too sentimental and weak. Unlike Phil, who considers himself a clever individual, he staged his own death to set everyone up. Facing death, Calvin makes a final attempt at a diversion. That's sufficient to divert Phil's attention. In 2001, Bob takes advantage of the moment and shoves him off the bridge. The friends plead with each other for forgiveness, give Harris the codes, and then proceed to the reunion. The boys make their grand entrance at the party in a helicopter. Calvin introduces Maggie to Bob and expresses his regret to her for never truly valuing his lover. Together, the three of them walk into the gym, just as the names of the prom king and queen are about to be revealed. Bob begins to panic and attempts to flee, but Calvin intervenes and stops him. Calvin has managed to hack into the voting system, ensuring Bob's victory. Bob then steps out from the crowd, greeted by loud applause. As he makes his way, he notices Trevor mocking him once more. However, this time, the big guy no longer fears Trevor. With a single punch, he knocks him out. Then, with confidence, he steps onto the stage. Bob speaks to the audience, recalling how he stood there helplessly 20 years ago, while everyone laughed at him. But now, everything has changed. He has a true friend who has shown him not to fear being himself. To everyone's shock, Bob removes his clothes and stands naked before them. Months go by. Bob waits outside for Calvin as he bids farewell to his pregnant wife. He's there to give his friend a keepsake and support him on his first day at the CIA. Do you have stories about friendships that have been rekindled after being apart for many years? If so, please post them in the comments section.